close your eyes. By 2022, one South African developer named Andre Cronje had built more DeFi infrastructure than anyone else. Yearn Finance, EP245, and dozens of protocols managing billions in assets. In March 2022, he announced he was leaving. No successor, no transition. Within hours, hundreds of millions of dollars in token value evaporated. The architecture of decentralized finance had been resting, more than anyone realized, on one person's willingness to continue. Imagine building something that changes the way hundreds of thousands of people interact with money. Building it not as a corporation, not as a funded startup with a team and a roadmap and investors expecting returns, but alone in your spare time, because the problem interests you and you believe the solution should exist. Imagine releasing it without announcement, without marketing, without even a properly tested product, because you believe in deploying early and learning from what breaks. Imagine watching it grow from a side project into a system controlling hundreds of millions of dollars, then billions, while you continue to work, continue to build, continue to deploy, because the alternative, stopping, has never felt like an option you could choose. And then imagine reaching a day when you simply cannot continue. When the weight of what you have built and the weight of what people expect of you because of it has become more than you can carry. This is the story of Andre Cronje, the South African developer who, in the span of roughly 2 years, built more significant DeFi infrastructure than any other builder in the history of the space, and who then, in March 2022, announced that he was leaving. Not retiring with fanfare, not handing off to a successor organization with a thoughtful transition plan, just leaving. Done. The announcement came in the form of a brief post from a colleague and was confirmed by the removal of his name from multiple protocol websites and social media profiles. Within hours of the news, the tokens associated with his projects lost hundreds of millions of dollars in value. Users scrambled. The DeFi ecosystem that had grown up around his work processed the event as a kind of founding father departure, the sudden absence of the person who had defined the space's ambitions and its rhythms. The reaction was extraordinary in proportion because what he had built was extraordinary in scope. Yearn Finance, the yield optimization protocol that made him famous, was the most visible piece of a portfolio that spanned dozens of protocols, dozens of DeFi primitives, and a period of furious building during which the person who was probably the most productive developer in the space was also the most publicly identified with that space's possibilities and its failures. When projects he had touched were exploited, he was the named target. When tokens associated with his name rose, he was credited. When they fell, he was blamed. The personality and the persona had fused in the public mind in a way that made his departure feel, to the people watching from outside, like the departure of an institution rather than a person. But he was not an institution. He was a person who had run out of runway. The distinct nature of his public identity in DeFi was itself a product of his approach to building. He posted on Twitter with transparency that was unusual, even in a space characterized by high transparency builder culture. He shared his thinking process, his frustrations, his doubts about given designs, his assessments of other protocols' approaches. He treated the public conversation about DeFi not as a marketing channel, but as a genuine intellectual space where ideas could be worked out in real time, where building and thinking were the same activity. This made him legible in ways that most builders in the space were not. It also made him accountable in ways that most builders were not, because the public had a clear record of what he had said, what he had promised, and what had happened to the things he had built. The transparency that made him trusted was also the transparency that made the criticism personal and direct. What followed over the next year was something neither the crypto space nor Andre Cronje himself had expected. He came back. Not immediately, not easily, not without the particular conditions that made returning possible for him rather than destructive. He came back because the problems he had been working on had not been solved in his absence, and he was still the person most likely to solve them. The story of his departure and return is, in miniature, a story about what happens when a truly creative person encounters the precise kind of demand that fame and financial stakes place on curiosity. It is a story that the DeFi ecosystem does not have a framework for yet, and that will likely recur until it does. In the next chapter, where Andre Cronje came from, his legal background, a decade in South African Fintech, and the precise perspective that let him read early DeFi code and immediately see the composability gaps that Yearn finance was designed to fill. Andre Cronje was born in South Africa in 1983 and grew up in a family that encouraged intellectual ambition. He pursued a degree in law before pivoting to information technology, a shift that reflected an early version of the pattern that would define his career, following curiosity across disciplinary boundaries rather than staying in the lane that credentials defined. The legal training was not wasted. It gave him a distinct attentiveness to the structure of systems, the way rules interact, the way exceptions expose the assumptions embedded in the rules, the way the gap between what a system says it does and what it actually does is where interesting problems live. This combination, legal thinking applied to technical systems, would become one of his most useful analytical frames when he arrived in the world of smart contracts, where the code is the law, and the gaps between what the code says and what the code does are the attack surface. He worked for a decade in South African fintech and technology consulting, building systems and solving problems in an industry where the gap between what software could theoretically do and what legacy financial infrastructure actually did was a constant source of frustration. He built payment systems, worked on banking integrations, and accumulated a particular kind of expertise that was neither purely academic nor purely operational. The expertise of someone who had spent years in the room between the specification and the implementation, understanding why the gap between them was usually larger than anyone wanted to admit. South Africa's fintech ecosystem was not Silicon Valley. The problems were different, the constraints were different, and the solutions had to work in an environment where infrastructure was less reliable and capital was less available. Building financial systems in that context gave him a hard-won pragmatism about what was achievable and what the actual bottlenecks were. The South African context is worth dwelling on because it shaped his perspective on what financial infrastructure was for. In a country where significant portions of the population had limited access to formal banking services, where the rand was subject to the kind of volatility that made holding local currency a risk in itself, and where the informal economy operated around formal financial systems rather than through them, the promise of permissionless financial infrastructure was not abstract. It was the promise of access, of tools that worked for anyone with an internet connection, regardless of their credit history, their nationality, or their relationship with existing institutions. This was not the primary thing driving him when he was reading Ethereum code in 2018, but it was part of the background against which he evaluated what was worth building and what the stakes were. The actual problems he chose to work on, yield optimization, automation, capital efficiency, were not the most directly aligned with financial inclusion, but they were part of an ecosystem whose underlying promise included inclusion as a genuine possibility. He came to cryptocurrency late by the standards of the early community, not in the Satoshi era, not in the 2013 bubble, but around 2018, when the DeFi ecosystem was just beginning to take shape and most of the protocols that would define it had not yet been built. His entry point was code review. He began reading the smart contract code underlying the early DeFi protocols and found himself simultaneously impressed and troubled by what he saw. Impressed by the elegance of certain designs, the way Uniswap's constant product formula produced a functioning price discovery mechanism from almost nothing, the way Compound's interest rate model created a market for capital without any order book. Troubled by the complexity, the inefficiency, the particular ways that protocols that were supposed to interact with each other did so in ways that left obvious improvements unexplored. He was seeing problems in the code the way he had learned to see problems in legal texts, as places where the gap between stated intent and actual behavior revealed both the assumptions that had gone unstated and the opportunities for a different approach. One pattern he noticed repeatedly in early DeFi code was the missed opportunity for composability. The way protocols had been designed as standalone systems rather than as components of a larger ecosystem that could interact with each other. The underlying premise of DeFi's promise was that financial primitives could be composed together, that a lending protocol and an exchange protocol and a yield protocol could interact without permission or intermediary. But the practical implementations of these protocols were often built with their own internal logic rather than with composability as a design principle. They worked in isolation, but created friction when combined. The improvement he saw was not in any single protocol, but in the layer above all of them, in the design space of protocols that could move assets fluidly between underlying protocols, routing capital toward the highest utility automatically. This was the insight that produced Yearn. Not that yield optimization was valuable, that was obvious, but that a smart contract could do it composably, capturing the benefits of multiple underlying protocols simultaneously without requiring the user to interact with any of them directly. The transition from reading other people's code to writing his own was rapid. He did not apply to join an existing team. He did not seek funding or validation. He began building things and deploying them to the Ethereum mainnet, announcing them on Twitter with a characteristic combination of technical precision and personal nonchalance. The products were often incomplete when he deployed them. He was explicit about this. He wrote announcements that said directly, "Do not use this contract with funds you cannot afford to lose." He meant it. Users ignored the warning and deposited funds anyway, because the products worked, and because in DeFi, a working unfinished product from a credible builder was more valuable than a polished product from an unknown team. This approach, deploy early, iterate publicly, accept that early versions would break, was philosophically sincere, but also, as the amounts of money in the ecosystem grew, increasingly dangerous. When a developer deploys an experiment that 100 people are using, the stakes of a bug are limited. When the same developer's experiment has $1 billion in it, the stakes are existential for the people whose money is there. The project that defined Andre Cronje was Yearn Finance, launched in February 2020. Yearn began as a personal yield optimization tool, software that Andre had built to automatically move his own stablecoin holdings between lending protocols to capture the highest available interest rate at any given moment. The concept was simple. DeFi lending protocols offered varying interest rates depending on supply and demand, and those rates changed continuously. A depositor who manually moved funds between protocols to capture the best rate would spend all their time doing operations research and executing transactions, incurring gas costs with each move. A smart contract that did this automatically, checking rates across protocols, calculating whether the gas cost of a rebalance was justified by the improvement in yield, and executing the move when it was obviously useful. What distinguished Yearn from similar ideas was not the concept, but the execution. The contract worked reliably, it was efficient in its gas usage, and it was transparent in its logic. He deployed it publicly in February 2020 with minimal announcement. Users who found it discovered that it worked. The automatic yield optimization was doing what it claimed to do, capturing returns that manual management could not easily match without significant effort. The total value locked grew from essentially nothing to hundreds of millions of dollars over the following months, as yield farmers in the rapidly expanding DeFi ecosystem discovered Yearn and brought their capital to it. The growth was driven entirely by utility. There was no marketing, no token incentive structure, no referral program. People used Yearn because it made them more money on their stablecoin deposits than any alternative they had found. And they told other people, and those people came and brought their capital, and the cycle continued. The governance token launch in July 2020 transformed Yearn from a useful tool into a phenomenon. YFI, the Yearn governance token, was distributed entirely to users who provided liquidity or used the protocol, with no allocation to the founder, no allocation to investors, no pre-mine of any kind. This distribution model was unusual enough that the crypto community took immediate notice. Here was a genuinely valuable DeFi protocol whose creator had taken nothing for himself. No tokens, no equity, no financial stake beyond whatever YFI he might have earned by using the protocol like any other user. Andre Cronje had built one of the most useful yield products in DeFi and had declined to enrich himself from it. The token launched at essentially zero and rose, within weeks, to values above Bitcoin, briefly trading above $40,000 per token, making YFI one of the fastest appreciating tokens in crypto history. People who had been in the protocol from the beginning, providing the liquidity that the yield strategies required, had received substantial YFI allocations that were now worth significant money. The distribution was sincerely fair, in a space where genuine fairness was truly rare. The distinct financial choice to distribute all the YFI without retaining any for himself was one that he later described in interviews as a deliberate statement about what he was building and why. He was not building Yearn to make money. He was building it because the problem interested him and the solution should exist. Taking a large personal allocation of a token that he had designed and deployed would have changed his relationship to the protocol, would have made him a financial stakeholder with interests that could diverge from the user's interests in ways that would complicate his decisions about how to evolve it. The zero allocation was not only ethical, it was, in his view, technically correct, a way of keeping his incentives aligned with the protocol's utility rather than with its token price. The principle was sound. The practical consequence, combined with his high public profile, was that he became one of the most influential people in DeFi, with essentially no direct financial interest in the success of the thing he had built, which was itself an unusual condition that shaped when entered the particular forms of pressure he later experienced. The community that formed around Yearn was shaped partly by this act of founder generosity. The DeFi space was full of projects in which founders had allocated large percentages of token supply to themselves. Yearn was different, and the difference attracted a particular kind of community. People who were drawn to the project's unusual combination of genuine utility, founder restraint, and technical ambition. The Yearn governance community became one of the most active in DeFi, with contributors from across the ecosystem proposing and implementing new strategies for the vaults. The vault system itself, the framework that allowed Yearn to deploy different yield strategies for different assets, switching between them as market conditions changed, became a model that other protocols copied and extended. Andre Cronje had invented, essentially by solving his own problem, a category of DeFi product that would grow to manage billions of dollars across dozens of protocols over the following years. Andre was notably uncomfortable with the attention that came with Yearn's success. He gave interviews, but seemed to treat the celebrity as an intrusion rather than a reward. He continued building. Yearn's vault strategy system became a framework for yield optimization that other protocols built on, and he continued designing and deploying new vaults and new strategies with the same pace and the same directness he had brought to the early versions. He also continued doing things that made risk managers and investors nervous, announcing new projects before they were finished, deploying contracts with explicit warnings that they should not be used, and then watching as users ignored the warnings and deposited funds that were subsequently lost when the unfinished contracts behaved unexpectedly. The pattern troubled observers who argued that his responsibility to his community should include not deploying things that he himself had labeled dangerous. His response, characteristically, was that the warnings were clear, that adults could assess risk for themselves, and that the alternative, never deploying anything until it was perfect, would mean never deploying anything at all. The precise tension between his building velocity and the safety expectations that his prominent position created was never resolved, only managed at varying degrees of adequacy across different projects. The early Yearn contracts had been exploited. Later projects had been exploited. The pattern of deployment exploit rebuild was consistent and was accepted by the community as the price of building at his pace, right up to the point at which the amounts involved became large enough that the pattern was no longer acceptable to the people bearing the losses. The growing sophistication of the DeFi ecosystem meant that the exploits were increasingly sophisticated, increasingly well-funded, and increasingly targeted at protocols whose code bore the concrete fingerprint of his approach. Fast, clever, not fully audited, based on the assumption that visible code in a public environment was sufficient to attract the scrutiny needed to catch major vulnerabilities. That assumption was sometimes right. When it was wrong, the losses were real and were borne by particular people with uneven amounts they could not afford to lose. The range of what Andre Cronje built between 2019 and 2022 was extraordinary by the standards of any individual developer. Yearn Finance was the largest and most celebrated, but it was one item in a list that included Keep3 Network, a decentralized job market for smart contract automation tasks that allowed protocols to pay the execution of actual on-chain functions without running their own infrastructure. Fixed Forex, a system for trading various fiat-pegged currencies in DeFi with lower slippage than conventional exchanges. And Solidly, an automated market maker designed for the Phantom network that introduced a novel model for liquidity incentives and token emissions. He contributed to or collaborated on dozens of other protocols whose founders sought his expertise or whose problems interested him enough to engage. Each of these was a real product, designed to solve a real problem and built with the particular technical competence that had produced Yearn. Not all of them worked as intended. Not all of them survived. But the rate of genuine innovation, the number of ideas that moved from concept to deployed infrastructure in the span of weeks, was remarkable even by the fast standards of DeFi. His relationship with the Phantom network became particularly significant. Phantom was an Ethereum-compatible blockchain that had positioned itself as a faster and cheaper alternative to Ethereum, with transaction fees that were a small fraction of Ethereum's gas costs at peak usage. Andre had moved substantial development activity to Phantom in 2021, partly because Ethereum's gas costs had made experimenting on mainnet expensive, and partly because Phantom's technical team had built infrastructure that made the deployment experience significantly smoother. The Phantom Foundation actively supported his work with grants and technical resources. The relationship was mutually beneficial. His activity drew developers and capital to the chain, and the chain provided the environment he needed to build at the speed he preferred. By 2021, Phantom's DeFi ecosystem was growing faster than most competing chains, largely because one developer had decided to build there. The concentration of developmental energy that Phantom achieved through its relationship with Andre Cronje was, in the competitive landscape of 2021 blockchain development, an unusually direct example of how personality can shape infrastructure adoption. Blockchain networks compete for developers, for capital, and for the liquidity that makes their DeFi ecosystems useful. The standard competition involves grants, improved developer tooling, and marketing to developer communities. Phantom's relative advantage was not primarily the quality of its grants program or the elegance of its developer documentation. It was that one credible, prolific developer had chosen it as his preferred deployment environment. Other developers followed his activity. Capital followed the developers. Protocols built on those protocols. The entire compounding process of ecosystem development was driven, at its initial stage, by the preferences of a single person. The Phantom team understood this and invested substantially in the relationship. The concentration of dependency was a risk that they accepted because the alternative, slower, more diffuse ecosystem development, was less competitive in the short term. The dependence of an entire blockchain ecosystem on the continued participation of a single developer was a concentration risk that no one had fully accounted for until it became acute. The Phantom Foundation had built technical infrastructure, maintained validator networks, and supported development through grants. But the draw that had brought capital to the chain was not the infrastructure. It was the distinct projects that a given person had built or indicated he would build. When that person left, the infrastructure remained, but the gravitational pull was gone. Phantom's total value locked, which had been among the highest in DeFi, dropped dramatically in the weeks following the announcement of his departure. Protocols that had built on his deployed infrastructure or had expected his continued involvement faced the particular challenge of explaining to their own communities that the person their protocol had been built around was no longer there. The scale of the ecosystem that had formed around him created pressures that accumulated in ways that were not always visible from the outside. Every project he deployed attracted users whose financial well-being depended on the project's continuing operation and maintenance. Every partnership or collaboration he entered created teams and communities whose expectations of his continued involvement were rarely stated explicitly, but were deeply assumed. The public persona, Andre Cronje, the developer who builds the future of finance in his spare time for the love of the problem, was genuine in its essential character, but unsustainable as a full-time reality at the scale it had reached. The love of the problem did not change the fact that the problem had become enormous, complex, and attached to an increasingly large number of people's financial security. His curiosity had always moved faster than the infrastructure around it, faster than the governance mechanisms that were supposed to distribute the responsibility, faster than any reasonable model of what one person could maintain. The precise events that preceded Andre's March 2022 announcement are not fully documented in any public account, but the general shape of the situation is clear from what he has said in interviews before and after his departure. He had been working at a pace that was not sustainable for years. The psychological weight of being the named founder of protocols controlling billions of dollars and of having no recourse when those protocols were exploited or manipulated beyond absorbing the public anger and the personal responsibility had become crushing. The compound effect of years of public accountability without adequate distance from it, years of building in conditions of chronic sleep deprivation, and years of watching the creative work he loved become entangled with financial stakes and public expectations that made the work feel less like building and more like managing, had eroded the reserves that creativity requires. DeFi's culture of public accountability carried a sharp edge for high-profile developers. When a protocol was exploited, the founders' Twitter mentions filled with fury. When a new project was delayed or performed differently than early descriptions had suggested, the accusation of fraud was ready and frequently deployed. Andre had been publicly accused, regularly and loudly, of orchestrating pump-and-dump schemes, of planning exploits in advance, of treating the DeFi community as marks for personal enrichment, accusations that were not supported by evidence, that he consistently denied, and that came in volumes and with a specificity that was difficult to screen out and impossible to fully ignore. The distance between the accusations and his actual motivation, the person who had distributed all the YFI tokens, who had repeatedly warned users not to use his early contracts, was enormous. But the accusations came from the same channels through which the legitimate information came, and the volume was sufficient to create a persistent background noise that had real effects on his ability to focus and continue. The Solidly launch on Phantom in January 2022 proved to be a breaking point. Solidly was an ambitious automated market maker that introduced a novel token emissions model inspired by Curve Finance's vote escrowed tokenomics, adapted for a different deployment context and combined with new mechanics that Cronje believed would improve on prior approaches. The design was authentically innovative. It attempted to solve a particular problem with liquidity incentive structures that had been identified as a weakness in existing AMM designs. But its launch was preceded by an extended period of anticipation that created expectations the mechanics could not fully satisfy. In the weeks before Solidly's launch, a competition had emerged among Phantom protocols to accumulate voting power that would determine how the new system's liquidity emissions would be directed. Protocols raised capital, negotiated alliances, and cultivated voter bases to position themselves favorably. The amounts deployed in this competition were, for some teams, significant fractions of their treasury holdings. When Solidly launched and the mechanics produced distributions that differed from what the competition's winners had modeled, the losses were immediate and public. The Solid token itself, which had traded at elevated prices on secondary markets during the pre-launch period, collapsed within days as the emissions schedule disappointed expectations. The anger was proportional to the bets, and it was directed loudly and personally at the developer whose design choices had set the rules of a game that had ended differently than many of its players had calculated. Andre Cronje was not responsible for their leverage or their assumptions. But his name was on the mechanism, and his Twitter mentions in the weeks that followed were a catalog of loss, accusation, and fury that had no clear end. What made the accountability structure particularly difficult was its asymmetry. Building was a solitary act, one developer, a text editor, a deployed contract. The criticism that followed was distributed across thousands of accounts, arriving continuously through the same applications he used to communicate with his community, indistinguishable in his notifications from the responses he actually wanted to read. Each deployment created a new permanent surface for criticism. The contracts did not disappear once deployed. They continued to exist, to be used, to occasionally fail, and when they failed, they generated fresh waves of accusation that landed on the same person who had deployed them months or years earlier. The past builds never stopped being attributable to him. A developer at a company who ships a product that later has a bug is accountable to a small number of identifiable managers through a defined process. A developer who ships smart contracts to a public blockchain is accountable to everyone who lost money forever through no process at all, in a medium where the most extreme expression of anger is always just one refresh away. The volume was not incidental to the harm. It was the harm. The cumulative weight of this accountability model had been building for years before Cronje solidly made it acute. He had watched people lose money in exploits of contracts he had explicitly labeled as unfinished. He had watched the tokens associated with his projects be used as instruments of speculation entirely disconnected from the underlying utility. He had watched his name become a brand that attracted capital and expectations at a scale that no single person could sustainably bear. The psychological toll was visible to people who were paying attention. His posting patterns changed. His public engagement became more sporadic, then more defensive. The person who had once announced half-finished experiments with infectious intellectual excitement was beginning to look like someone who was running out of energy to keep going. In the period before his departure, several people who had worked with him described a person who was simultaneously highly productive, still writing code, still deploying, still thinking about the next problem, and visibly deteriorating in the ways that excessive sustained stress produces in people over time. He was not sleeping adequately. He was not separating his professional activity from the stream of public criticism that arrived continuously through social media. He was maintaining the pace that had defined his career, while no longer having the psychological reserves that had allowed him to maintain that pace in earlier years. This combination, high output, insufficient recovery, constant public pressure, is a reliable path toward collapse, and the people who were close enough to observe it recognized what was coming even before the formal announcement. They were not surprised when it arrived. They were relieved that it had arrived as a departure rather than as something worse. In March 2022, Anton Nell, a developer who had worked closely with Andre, announced on Twitter that both he and Andre were leaving the DeFi ecosystem. The announcement was brief. Andre's name disappeared from the team pages of the projects he had been associated with. He did not give an extended explanation at the time. He simply stopped. The silence after years of constant public building was its own statement, legible to anyone who had been watching, even though the actual words that would explain it were not yet available. The market's reaction to Andre Cronje's departure was immediate and severe. Tokens associated with his projects fell dramatically within hours of the announcement. Phantom's FTM token lost a significant fraction of its value over the following days, as the capital that had flowed to the Phantom ecosystem in anticipation of his continued work began to flow out. Protocols across DeFi that had built on Yearn strategies or keep-through infrastructure faced questions about ongoing maintenance and development that did not have clear answers. The total value locked across the Phantom DeFi ecosystem fell by hundreds of millions of dollars in the week following the announcement, as capital that had come specifically because of his presence began to seek alternatives. The event was a vivid demonstration of a risk that the DeFi ecosystem had largely failed to account for: key person dependency at the infrastructure level. Ethereum itself was designed to be resistant to any individual's departure. The protocol runs on thousands of nodes, and no single developer's absence would stop it. But the DeFi protocols built on Ethereum were, in many cases, deeply dependent on particular individuals for their continued development, maintenance, and the distinct credibility that came from the founders' active involvement. Andre Cronje was the most extreme example of this dependency, but he was not the only one. Other high-profile developers had experienced scaled-down versions of the same dynamic, where their departure from or reduced involvement in a project had produced capital outflows and community uncertainty disproportionate to the technical changes in the protocol itself. The market was pricing not just the protocol's current utility, but the implied future development that the founders' continued involvement was expected to produce. The nature of the dependency was instructive. It was not merely technical. It was not the case that the protocols would stop working because only Andre could update their code. Yearn and Keep3 had governance mechanisms and developer communities that could continue development. The dependency was something more subtle. The confidence that Capital had in these protocols was confidence that was in part confidence in him. His active presence signaled that the protocols were being watched, maintained, and evolved by someone with the particular judgment and the precise work ethic that had built them. His absence removed that signal. Capital that had been priced on the assumption of his continued involvement was suddenly priced on the assumption of his absence, and the difference between those two prices was what the market movements measured. The human cost of his departure extended beyond the financial. Communities that had formed around his projects lost their sense of direction and their feeling of connection to the person who had defined their mission. Developers who had built careers contributing to his protocols faced uncertainty about whether those protocols would continue to be centers of innovation. Users who had grown accustomed to the steady stream of new products and new ideas from a single, prolific, trusted source found themselves in a DeFi landscape that felt quieter. The energy that he had brought to the space, the speed of deployment, the directness of communication, the willingness to ship imperfect things and iterate in public, was truly unusual, and its absence was felt in a way that was difficult to describe precisely, but was obvious to anyone who had been paying attention to the space before and after. The DeFi ecosystem had not previously encountered the departure of someone so central to its creative momentum, and it did not have frameworks for processing the loss gracefully. Several of the developers who had worked most closely with him described the period following his departure as professionally disorienting, in ways that went beyond the practical challenges of maintaining protocols whose primary architect had left. The working relationship with him had been, for many of them, the kind of intellectually generative partnership that is rare to find and difficult to replicate. He thought quickly, communicated precisely about what he was trying to build and why, and moved from idea to implementation at a pace that made collaborating with him feel like participating in a continuous creative process rather than executing a predetermined plan. The absence of that dynamic, the loss not just of his protocols, but of his distinctive way of working, created a gap that individual contributors struggled to fill, not because they lacked capability, but because the collaborative environment he had created was particular to him and did not easily transfer to a mode of working without him. Andre Cronje was not gone for long. By early 2023, approximately a year after his departure announcement, he was publicly discussing DeFi again, posting on social media about problems he was thinking about, engaging with protocol discussions, and signaling that his departure from the ecosystem had been a departure from a prior mode of engagement rather than from the subject matter that had defined his career for 4 years. The return was gradual and careful in a way that his departures had never been. Where he had left abruptly through a colleague's brief announcement, he returned incrementally through his own voice, in a way that allowed him to set the terms of his re-engagement, rather than having them set by the expectations that had previously accumulated around him. He returned, initially, in a more limited role. Rather than the prolific independent deployer of multiple simultaneous projects, he focused more specifically on Phantom Foundation work and on actual technical problems that interested him, without the same public performance of perpetual construction. He had, by his own account, spent his time away thinking carefully about the particular aspects of his prior engagement that had been unsustainable. The public accountability model, the expectation that he would respond to every criticism, the implicit obligation to maintain and develop every protocol he had ever touched, and about what conditions would allow him to work in the space without being destroyed by it. The answer he arrived at was not a complete withdrawal from the demands of public building, but a more deliberate management of those demands. Fewer simultaneous projects, more explicit communication about what he was and was not committing to, and a clearer separation between the work he was doing and the expectations that the work attracted. The community's response to his return was warm but measured, warmer in many respects than might have been expected given the disruption his departure had caused. The DeFi community is accustomed to disappointment from high-profile departures and returns, and there is a distinct kind of goodwill that accumulates around builders who are seen as genuine rather than mercenary. Andre's years of building, combined with the absence of any credible evidence that his work had been primarily self-enriching, the YFI launch with no founder allocation remained one of the most unusual acts of founder generosity in the space's history, had created a reserve of goodwill that survived the messy circumstances of his departure. People who had been angry about the Solidly launch or about the disruption his departure had caused to protocols they cared about were also, in many cases, people who recognized the genuine value of what he had built and were glad he was not gone permanently. The projects he returned to and the new work he undertook in the post-return period were less dramatically publicized than his prior work. He built more carefully, announced less breathlessly, and maintained a lower public profile. The transformation was not complete. His natural mode was still to build quickly and deploy early, but it was genuine in the particular ways that mattered. He was more deliberate about the claims he made in public, more careful about the expectations he set, and more honest about the limitations of what any one person could sustainably maintain. The return suggested that the burnout had been a crisis of sustainability rather than a crisis of commitment, that the curiosity and the capability that had built Yearn and EP245 and the rest had survived the departure, and needed only a different relationship with the public role that had consumed the builder of those things. The conditions he had described as necessary for his return, the precise changes in how he engaged publicly, how he communicated about ongoing and future projects, and how he managed the relationship between his technical work and his public persona, were not dramatic concessions. They were the kinds of adjustments that people in demanding public roles often make when they recognize that the pace they have been maintaining is not compatible with long-term continuation. What was unusual was not the adjustments themselves, but the visibility of the process. In most industries, a person who burns out in a prominent role either leaves permanently or returns in a reduced capacity with minimal public discussion. In DeFi, where the community's emotional investment in its builders is intense, and where public communication is the primary medium through which trust is built and maintained, the conversation about how he would return and on what terms was itself a public event. The community watched and commented, and the watching and commenting were part of what made the return workable. Not just for him, but for the community that needed to recalibrate its expectations. The story of Andre Cronje is, in the end, a story about what it costs to build public infrastructure alone. The analogy that has been made most frequently is to open-source software development, to the developers who built Linux, Apache, OpenSSL, or any of the other foundational tools of the internet that billions of people depend on. These tools were built by individuals or small groups, largely without financial compensation, largely without public recognition until something broke and the dependency became visible. The analogy is accurate as far as it goes. The difference is that DeFi infrastructure, unlike most open-source software, controls money directly. The protocols Andre built were not tools that facilitated other applications. They were themselves financial instruments that held and moved real assets. The stakes of a bug or a failure were immediate and financial in a way that is unusual even in the broader world of critical infrastructure. A bug in Linux might allow an attacker to gain unauthorized access to a system. A bug in a Yearn vault might allow an attacker to drain it. The consequences were in the same class: unauthorized access, financial harm, but the immediacy and irreversibility of the financial harm was greater. And the person who built the vault was personally identified with that harm in a way that the anonymous contributors to a Linux kernel patch were not. The public visibility of DeFi developers, combined with the financial stakes of their work, created a model of personal accountability that had no clear precedent in the history of software development. The DeFi ecosystem has not solved the problem of sustainable development that Andre's Burnout illustrated. The dominant model, individual developers building protocols, launching governance tokens that distribute ownership to users, and then either stepping back from direct development or burning out from the combination of technical work and community management, continues to produce remarkable innovation and recurring dysfunction. The governance tokens were supposed to distribute responsibility as well as ownership. In practice, they have often distributed financial upside while leaving the technical and reputational burden concentrated in the original developer. The token holders who vote in governance have real power over protocol parameters, but rarely have the technical capacity to maintain the underlying code. The result is a model in which the developers bear the technical burden and the accountability burden simultaneously, while the distribution of ownership has reduced the direct financial reward for bearing those burdens. The structural solution that this situation calls for is not complicated to describe in the abstract. DeFi protocols need what traditional financial software companies have: funded development teams whose technical knowledge is shared rather than concentrated, explicit documentation of design decisions and their reasoning, formalized succession structures that allow protocols to continue when key contributors step back, and professional community management that absorbs the social pressure of the relationship between developers and users. None of these things are incompatible with decentralization at the protocol level. What they are incompatible with is the move fast and ship it founder culture that produced the early DeFi ecosystem's remarkable velocity. The choice between speed and sustainability is real, and the DeFi ecosystem has consistently chosen speed while being repeatedly surprised when the cost of that choice lands on the people who were moving fastest. Andre Cronje was the most prolific person in the space, the one moving fastest, and the one who paid the highest visible cost. The comparison to traditional software development companies is illuminating here. A software company that builds financial infrastructure employs engineers who can be replaced when they leave, processes that document the reasoning behind technical decisions, code review practices that distribute technical knowledge across a team, and professional management of the relationship between the technical staff and the people who use the software. None of these structures are magical. They add overhead, they slow some things down, they create bureaucracies that can be dysfunctional. But they are designed to solve the problem that burned out Andre Cronje: the concentration of technical expertise, institutional knowledge, and public accountability in a single person who has no structural mechanism for managing the load. The DeFi ecosystem's allergy to traditional organizational structures, an allergy that is in some ways principled and in some ways merely a rationalization for speed, is part of why the problem keeps recurring. More durable models are being explored: development-focused DAOs with professional compensation structures, protocol guilds that maintain shared infrastructure across multiple projects, and more explicit succession planning that reduces key person dependencies. Whether any of these models will prove more sustainable than the lone genius builder pattern that Andre Cronje exemplified remains to be seen. The problem is real. The solutions are still being worked out, and the ecosystem is still producing people who, like him, are drawn to the problems before the solutions exist and willing to build in public before the products are ready. The next person who burns out will do so for similar reasons and in a similar context. The question is whether the ecosystem will have learned from watching Andre leave and return anything about how to treat the people who build it. Andre Cronje's legacy in DeFi is unusual because it is both enormous and ambivalent. The protocols he built, primarily Yearn Finance, but also EP245 and contributions to dozens of others, are real, working systems that provide genuine utility to real users and that have influenced how the space thinks about yield optimization, automation, and incentive design. The ideas he explored, often in early, imperfect deployments before they were ready for significant capital, have shaped the design space of DeFi in ways that are traceable even when the concrete contracts he deployed have been superseded by more polished versions. The vocabulary of yield vaults, of automated strategy execution, of composable DeFi primitives that interact without permission, much of this was built or popularized by one person who simply found the problems interesting and built things to solve them. At the same time, the people who lost money in exploits of his early contracts, and the people who lost money when his departure triggered sharp price declines in tokens associated with his work, experienced real harm. His approach, deploy early, accept that things will break, expect users to understand the risks, was intellectually coherent, but practically demanding to the users who did not fully understand what early deployment meant in a space where the stakes were so high. The responsibility he bore for those losses, and the way that responsibility was mediated by pseudonymous criticism on social media at volumes that no one person was designed to absorb, was part of what ultimately drove him out. The ambivalence of his legacy is not resolvable into a simple verdict. He built remarkable things, and people were harmed by some of those things, and both of those facts are true and important. The question of who bears responsibility when a developer warns users not to use a contract and users use it anyway is not a simple one in the context of DeFi. In traditional finance, a financial product cannot be offered to retail investors with a warning that it is dangerous and unfinished. The warning itself would constitute grounds for regulatory intervention. In DeFi, there is no regulatory mechanism for this. Developers deploy to permissionless blockchains. Users interact with what they find there. The warning is on the developer's Twitter feed, not in any legally recognized document, and its status as meaningful disclosure is contested. Andre's position, that he had been clear that users had made their own choices, that the alternative was never to build anything, was defensible as a philosophical position. It was also, as the exploits accumulated and the losses grew, increasingly inadequate as a complete account of the developer-user relationship in a space where the gap between technical knowledge and financial stakes was so large. He was not the most technically sophisticated developer in DeFi, by his own account. He was not the most cautious. He was not the most politically skilled or the most effective at building durable organizations. What he was, distinctively, was the most prolific and the most willing to take ideas from conception to deployed smart contract in the shortest possible time. And in a space where the gap between interesting idea and deployed infrastructure was the primary bottleneck, that particular combination of qualities was enormously generative. The ideas existed before he built them, in the sense that other developers could see the same gaps and the same opportunities. What he provided was the individual willingness to act on those ideas immediately, publicly, at personal risk, before the conditions were optimal. That willingness produced a remarkable amount of what the DeFi ecosystem now takes for granted. The DeFi ecosystem that exists today, the yields, the vaults, the automation, the permissionless composability of financial primitives, was built by hundreds of developers and hundreds of projects over years of accumulated work. But the actual shape of what was possible and the particular cadence at which it was built was influenced disproportionately by one South African developer who read other people's code, found it incomplete, and started building what was missing. That he eventually reached a limit does not diminish what he built. It makes the story more human. The limit was not evidence that the builder was insufficient. It was evidence that what was being asked of him was more than a person should be asked to bear indefinitely by any measurement. There is a distinct kind of creativity that operates at the intersection of deep technical knowledge and impatience with the gap between what exists and what could exist. It is the creativity that produces not just ideas, but implementations. Not just proposals, but deployed contracts. Not just designs, but working systems that people can use before they are perfect. It is a creativity that is difficult to institutionalize and easy to destroy. Andre Cronje had it in unusual abundance. The DeFi ecosystem used it without adequately valuing it, rewarded it with money and attention that created more burden than support, and then expressed shock when the person who carried it chose to put it down. The lesson for the ecosystem and for the people who will build the next phase of it is about the conditions that creative productivity requires. Not just the freedom to deploy, but the protection from the particular forms of pressure that make deployment unsustainable. That lesson has not been fully learned, but his story and his return suggest it is at least being heard. Close your eyes again if they have opened in the night. Somewhere in the archives of DeFi Twitter, the posts from the years of building are still there. The cryptic announcements, the warnings that deployed contracts should not be used, the technical explanations posted at 2 in the morning, the acknowledgments of failure, and the immediate pivots to the next iteration. The record of a person thinking in public, building in public, failing in public, and building again. Not a corporation, not a team, not a brand, a person following the problems that interested him until the problems became too heavy to carry alone, and then finding a way to carry a different version of them. The contracts he deployed are still running. The yield that Yearn's vaults capture is still being captured automatically by the strategies that other developers have built on the architecture he created. The Keep3 network is still executing on-chain jobs that protocols have configured and paid for. The ideas he put into practice are living in the code that runs continuously on Ethereum and Phantom and across the other networks where his work reached. This is the particular kind of longevity that open smart contract infrastructure creates. The person may leave and return and leave again, but the deployed code does not depend on his continued presence to continue doing what it does. The building persists beyond the builder. It is one of the stranger features of the medium he chose, that what he made continues without him, that the yield vaults do not know or care whether their architect is tired, and that the record of their activity is as permanent and legible as anything that has ever been built. He is still building. The problems have not been solved. The curiosity has not gone away. Let the night be quiet now. Let the complexity of building and burning and returning rest with you. You are safe. You are still. Rest. Story end.